I have a short presentation, if I can have the clicker. Yeah. The one that's worn out. Okay, thank you all. Great pleasure to be here. So I want to, in my 10 minutes, just to do two things, basically. I'd like to present some charts from our world in data to describe what the global landscape of poverty and hunger looks like. And then I want to talk about what I think is an ethical consensus to end poverty and end hunger. So that's the share of people living in extreme poverty today from our world in data. The World Bank suggests that there are 719 million people currently living in extreme poverty. That's about 9% of the world population. But importantly, that's down from about 2 billion back in 1990. That's the landscape of extreme poverty in 1990. If you notice, it's not just sub-Saharan Africa, it's a lot of China and a lot of South Asia. So today, you see a very different picture. The landscape of extreme poverty is today more or less confined to sub-Saharan Africa with some pockets in South Asia, but it's been largely eliminated in China. Another dimension of poverty is life expectancy, and there we see a major gap in life expectancy between the rich and the poor world today, with again the lowest life expectancy taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. And this just tells us that poverty really has many different dimensions. It affects your health, it affects your physical health, your mental health, your resilience in life, your vulnerability to disease. All of these things are affected by living in extreme poverty. To talk briefly about undernourishment, again, you see very much confined to sub-Saharan Africa. Just to quote some figures, there are 828 million people today that are undernourished, severely undernourished. There are about 258 million people in acute food insecurity, and another 1.9 billion people that are moderately food insecure. And then there are 3 billion people who lack access to healthy diets. So kind of a stunning global picture when it comes to hunger and food insecurity. Extreme poverty is related to child mortality. As we see in countries with a lot of extreme poverty, you have a lot of child mortality. About 5 million children still die each year. That's down a lot. That's down from about 13 million in 1990. So vast progress, but still a shockingly high number of children still die each year from conditions related to extreme poverty. This is the share of extreme poverty and GDP per capita. We can see there's a downward sloping relationship up to a certain point, after which it goes to zero. After about GDP per capita of about $10,000, $15,000 per year, there's pretty much no extreme poverty. So that tells you that the first thing you want to do to eliminate extreme poverty is to boost your output per capita. I'm going to skip this one because I'm running a little fast. The World Bank estimates that the COVID pandemic pushed 70 million people into extreme poverty, and it also suggests that climate change could push another 100 million people into extreme poverty. So these shocks that we're facing are actually reversing some of the progress that we have seen over the past few decades. This shows the number of people in extreme poverty over the period of time, and we can see there that the number of people in extreme poverty by region, plus projections from 1990, the main takeaway there is the huge decline in extreme poverty in East Asia, largely driven by China. And again, this is the share. Since 1820, we can see a very big drop in extreme poverty. We can see the proportion living in extreme poverty in 1820 was pretty much everybody in the world. But today, it's down to, as I mentioned, 719 million people, about 9% of the world's population. So a big drop, but still we have a large way to go. And the final chart I want to show you is the share by region since 1980. You can see very clearly there that all regions have seen a decline in extreme poverty, but the biggest decline has taken place in East Asia and the Pacific, which is, again, largely driven by China. We see a decline in South Asia quite significantly, but not as much as in East Asia. And also we see a much smaller but still notable decline in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's positive news. For the remainder of my 10 minutes, I want to talk about an ethical consensus to end extreme poverty. And I am basing this on a book that we produced earlier this year called Ethics in Action for Sustainable Development, where we brought together experts from different religious and secular ethical traditions to come up with a shared moral consensus on the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the main areas of consensus we found was on ending poverty and ending hunger. So we can see this across all the different religions. We see it in Judaism, which really talks about the need to a moral obligation to care for the poor and to care for the excluded, leaving the gleanings of your fields for the poor, don't charging interest on the loans, every 7 years forgiving all debts. These, core aspects of economic justice from Judaism. And of course, in Christianity, don't need to go too much into that here, but Jesus said the standard of judgment is, do you feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, invite in the stranger, take care of the sick, and visit the imprisoned. And this finds form in the principle called the universal destination of goods, which suggests that the goods of the earth are destined for all people, not just the rich and not just the privileged. We see this also in the other religions. In Islam, the idea of human dignity and the common good also comes to the fore. In Buddhism, the idea of unlimited universal compassion towards all people. In Hinduism, the idea of the common good called loka sangraha, or the principle of ahimsa, which in positive form means love and compassion for all people. And we see it in Confucianism, which I think will be very interested to people in this room, because the key virtue there is the virtue of Ren, forgive my terrible pronunciation, which is, of course, benevolence or being humane. Or as one of the authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the Confucian scholar Peng Chang, who basically who translated this term into English as two-man-mindedness, a very humane principle. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a core aspect of our shared moral consensus on sustainable development in the world today. We can also see this moral consensus across the secular ethical tradition. We see it in virtue ethics, which says that human flourishing is blocked by extreme poverty, is blocked by hunger, and the detriment to poverty goes well beyond the material dimension, as Sister Helen already mentioned. We see it in utilitarianism, which says the greatest happiness of the greatest number is maximized by transferring income and wealth from rich people to poor people, because the benefit to happiness of the poor vastly exceeds the small reduction in happiness of the rich from an income transfer. We see it in Kantian deontology, which can be used to argue that poverty violates the autonomy and dignity of poor people. We see it in the human rights tradition, where, as I mentioned, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights references economic rights in Article 25, which includes the right to an adequate standard of living, which means no hunger, and no poverty. This is a core aspect of our shared moral consensus that we've inherited from 1948. We see it in the thought of John Rawls, which says that justice requires improving to the maximum extent the position of the least advantaged members of society, which calls for some transfers of income and wealth from rich people to poor people. And we see it finally in the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which says that what matters is not just lack of income, but the effective freedom to do what a person values doing or being. So again, poverty alleviation violates these core capabilities. The one exception, I'll finish on this point, the one exception to the moral consensus that I've outlined here is libertarianism. Libertarianism says that all market rewards are fairly and justly earned, and that the government has no business impeding the natural forces of the market or transferring income from the fortunate to the less fortunate. The ethical response to poverty, therefore, is simply to leave it alone and trust that the market will lift the material prospects of all people. Don't interfere with private property rights. As we all know, this doesn't work, and it violates the ethical and moral consensus we have across all the major religious and secular ethical traditions. Thank you.